In 1942, Nazi Air Chief Hermann Göring scoffed at America's plan to build 50,000 planes, calling it a fantasy. But as the war raged on, U.S. factories roared to life, producing not 50,000, but over 100,000 warplanes. The Luftwaffe was overwhelmed, and the skies belonged to the Allies. This is the untold story of how American industry silenced the skeptics and changed the course of history. The year is 1942. The world is at war, and the skies over Europe and the Pacific are filled with the roar of engines and the thunder of bombs. In Berlin, Nazi Air Chief Hermann Göring sits at a long table, advisors, has announced a plan to build 50,000 warplanes in a single year. The room erupts in laughter. Göring, a former fighter ace and the proud architect of the Luftwaffe, shakes his head in disbelief. 50,000 planes, the Americans are dreamers. They'll never do it. But across the Atlantic, in the factories and fields of America, something extraordinary is happening. The United States, a nation of carmakers, farmers, and shopkeepers, is transforming itself into the greatest arsenal the world has ever seen. The challenge is immense, the risks are real. But the determination is unstoppable. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt called for the production of 50,000 planes a year, even his closest advisors were stunned. The United States had never built more than 6,000 planes in a single year before the war. The task seemed impossible, but Roosevelt knew that air power would decide the fate of nations. He knew that the only way to defeat the Axis was to outbuild them, to overwhelm them with numbers, and to make the skies a fortress for democracy. The response was electric. Across the country, factories were converted overnight. Automobile plants that once made Fords and Chevrolets now churned out B-20 for Liberators and P-51 Mustangs. Shipyards and steel mills worked around the clock. The government poured billions into new plants, new tools, and new technologies. The workforce exploded, as millions of men and women, many of them working outside the home for the first time, answered the call. The face of the American war effort was changing. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of the new workforce, strong, determined, and unafraid. Women built engines, assembled wings, and tested planes. African Americans, long shut out of skilled jobs, found new opportunities in the factories. Immigrants, farmers, and city dwellers worked side by side, united by a common purpose. The scale of the effort was staggering. In Willow Run, Michigan, the Ford Motor Company built a factory a mile long, capable of producing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. In California, the Douglas and Lockheed plants turned out thousands of fighters and transports. In Kansas, Texas, and Georgia, new plants rose from the ground in months, their assembly lines stretching as far as the eye could see. But the challenge was more than just numbers. Building 50,000 planes meant solving problems no one had ever faced before. It meant designing new tools, training new workers, and inventing new ways to move parts and materials. It meant coordinating thousands of suppliers, from the smallest machine shop to the largest steel mill. It meant overcoming shortages, strikes, and setbacks. The engineers and designers worked around the clock. They streamlined production, simplified designs, and found ways to make planes faster, lighter, and stronger. Test pilots risked their lives to push new models to the limit. Every day brought new challenges and new solutions. The government played its part, too. The War Production Board set quotas, allocated resources, and kept the factories running. The Office of War Information launched campaigns to boost morale and encourage conservation. War bonds, scrap drives, and rationing became part of daily life. The entire nation was mobilized for one goal: victory. Berlin, Göring and his staff watched the reports with skepticism. They pointed to the Luftwaffe's victories in Poland, France, and the early days of the war. They believed that German engineering and discipline would always triumph over American improvisation and chaos. But as 1943 dawned, the first signs of change appeared. American planes began to arrive in Britain by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The skies over Europe grew crowded with B-17s, B-24s, and P-47s. The Luftwaffe, once the master of the air, found itself outnumbered and outgunned. The air war was changing. The Americans brought not just planes, but a new philosophy of warfare. They believed in mass production, an overwhelming force, and in the power of technology to solve any problem. They brought long-range bombers, high-altitude fighters, and new tactics that stretched the Luftwaffe to the breaking point. The German pilots fought bravely, but they could not be everywhere at once. For every plane they shot down, two more took its place. The factories in America ran day and night, their assembly lines never stopping. Göring could no longer laugh. The Luftwaffe was being overwhelmed. The skies over Germany were filled with the drone of American engines, the flash of bombs, and the contrails of fighters. The dream of air supremacy was dead, but the story was not over. The Americans did not stop at 50,000 planes. They kept building, kept innovating, kept pushing the limits of what was possible. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 100,000 aircraft, more than any nation in history. This was the miracle of American industry, the triumph of determination over doubt, and the answer to Göring's laughter. It was the story of how a nation came together, set an impossible goal, and achieved it, changing the course of history forever. The American factories did not sleep. Day and night, the assembly lines moved, powered by the hands of millions, in Detroit, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Dallas. The sound of riveting guns and the clang of metal became the heartbeat of a nation at war. The scale was almost beyond comprehension. At Willow Run, the world's largest bomber plant, workers built a B-20 for every hour. In Long Beach, California, the Douglas plant turned out C-47s and A-20s in endless streams. In Fort Worth, Texas, the roar of engines echoed as B-24s and B-32s rolled off the line. The workers came from every walk of life. Housewives, farm boys, college students, and retirees all found a place in the war effort. Women made up more than a third of the aircraft workforce. They learned to weld, to rivet, to read blueprints, and to solve problems on the fly. African Americans, Mexican Americans, and immigrants found new opportunities, breaking barriers that had stood for generations. The war was changing not just the factories, but the fabric of American society. The government coordinated the effort with military precision. The War Production Board set quotas and priorities, making sure that every bolt, every sheet of aluminum, every gallon of fuel went where it was needed most. The Office of Price Administration managed rationing, so that the home front could support the front lines. War bonds, scrap drives, and victory guerdons became part of daily life. The entire country was mobilized, united by a single purpose. The numbers kept climbing. In 1943, American factories produced 85,000 aircraft engines, 50,000 propellers, and 300 million pounds of aluminum. By 1944, the United States was building more planes in a month than Germany could in a year. The B-17, Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, the P-51 Mustang, and the P-47 Thunderbolt became icons of American power. Each one was a triumph of engineering, but also of logistics, teamwork, and determination. The planes were shipped by rail, by truck, and by air to ports on the east and west coasts. From there, they crossed oceans to reach the battlefronts. In England, American airfields sprang up overnight, their runways lined with row after row of bombers and fighters. In the Pacific, island bases were carved out of jungle and coral, each one a stepping stone toward Japan. The Luftwaffe watched in disbelief. Göring's intelligence officers reported the numbers, but the High Command refused to believe them. How could a nation of civilians, a country that had never fought a modern war, outbuild the Reich? But the evidence was in the skies. American bombers filled the daylight hours over Germany, their formations stretching for miles. Fighters escorted them all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now on the defensive. German pilots flew mission after mission. But the odds grew worse with every sortie. For every Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf that took off, there were 2, 3, or 4 American planes waiting. The losses mounted. Veteran pilots were killed or captured, replaced by green recruits with only a few hours of training. The Luftwaffe's fuel and spare parts ran short. The factories that built German planes were bombed day and night, their output crippled by the relentless American offensive. On the home front, the American people followed the progress of the air war with pride and anxiety. Newspapers published photos of new planes, stories of heroic pilots, and charts showing the rising production numbers. Children collected scrap metal and rubber. Women rolled bandages and packed parachutes, and families planted victory gardens to supplement their rations. The war touched every life, every home, every community. The scale of the effort was staggering. By the end of 1944, American factories had produced more than 96,000 planes. The goal of 50,000, once marked as fantasy, had been left far behind. The United States was building bombers faster than the enemy could shoot them down, and fighters faster than the Luftwaffe could replace its losses. And Berlin, Göring could no longer hide his concern. Reports from the front were grim. The Luftwaffe was losing control of the skies. American bombers struck targets deep inside Germany with impunity. The once proud Air Force was being ground down, its pilots exhausted, its planes outnumbered and outclassed. But the Americans did not stop. In 1945, as the war reached its climax, the factories kept running. The final tally would be more than 100,000 planes-built fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers. The skies over Europe and the Pacific belonged to the Allies. The laughter in Berlin was gone. Göring, who had once scoffed at the idea of 50,000 planes, now faced the reality of American power. The Luftwaffe, the pride of Nazi Germany, had been overwhelmed not just by technology or tactics, but by the sheer weight of American industry and resolve. The story of America's 100,000 planes is a story of ambition, sacrifice, and unity. It is the story of a nation that refused to accept limits, that turned doubt into determination, and that proved the impossible was possible. It is a story that changed the course of history and silenced the skeptics forever. The skies over Europe and the Pacific became a living testament to American industrial might. Every day, new squadrons of bombers and fighters arrived at forward airfields, their wings gleaming in the sun, their engines roaring with promise. The air was never silent. The drone of B-17s and B-24s, the whistle of P-51s and P-47s, and the thunder of engines became the soundtrack of liberation and destruction. In England, Airfields stretched for miles, each one a hive of activity. Mechanics worked around the clock, refueling, rearming, and repairing the endless stream of aircraft. Pilots, many barely out of their teens, were briefed on their missions, climbed into cockpits, and took to the sky with a sense of purpose and fear. The scale of the American air armada was overwhelming. On some days, more than 1,000 bombers would take off in a single morning, escorted by hundreds of fighters. The Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept, but the odds were hopeless. The German pilots fought with skill and courage, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. For every American plane shot down, more arrived to take its place, the Luftwaffe's aces. Once the terror of the skies, found themselves hunted by swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The air battles were fierce, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Americans had achieved what Göring had called impossible: air supremacy. The impact on the ground was devastating for Germany. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and military bases were bombed relentlessly. The American bombers struck by day, the British by night. The German war machine, already stretched thin, began to collapse under the weight of constant attack. Supplies ran short, transportation broke down, and morale plummeted. The once mighty Luftwaffe was reduced to a shadow, its planes destroyed on the ground or in the air, its pilots exhausted and demoralized. In the Pacific, the story was the same. American planes flew from island bases and aircraft carriers, striking Japanese positions with growing frequency and power. The lessons learned in the factories and airfields of America were put to use in the jungles and atolls of the Pacific. The B-29 Super Fortress, the most advanced bomber of its time, carried the war to the Japanese home islands, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Back home, the American people watched the newsreels and read the headlines with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Every new plane that rolled off the assembly line was a symbol of hope, but also a reminder of the cost of war. Families waited for letters from sons and brothers, prayed for their safe return, and mourned those who did not come home. The war touched every corner of the nation, but it also united the country in a way that few events ever had. The numbers told the story. By the end of the war, the United States had produced more than 300,000 aircraft of all types. The goal of 50,000 planes, once a source of ridicule, had been surpassed many times over. The factories that had built cars and refrigerators before the war now stood as monuments to American ingenuity and resolve. In the ruins of Berlin, Göring faced the consequences of his arrogance. The Luftwaffe was finished, its planes destroyed, its pilots gone. The American air armada, born of ambition and necessity, had changed the course of the war. The laughter that had once filled the halls of Powell was replaced by silence and defeat. The legacy of America's 100,000 planes endures. It is a story of what can be achieved when a nation comes together, when every hand and every mind is turned to a common purpose. It is a story of overcoming doubt, of turning ridicule into resolve, and of proving that the impossible is possible. The war ended, but the lessons remained: the power of industry, the importance of unity, and the value of determination became guiding principles for a new era. The skies, once a battleground, became a symbol of freedom and possibility. In the aftermath of victory, the world took stock of what had been accomplished. The numbers were staggering, almost beyond belief. American factories had produced more than 100,000 warplanes, fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers, each one a testament to the nation's resolve. The assembly lines that had once seemed A fantasy to Göring and the Luftwaffe had become the engine of Allied victory. Historians and military leaders would later call it the arsenal of democracy. The phrase captured the spirit of a nation that had turned its vast resources and ingenuity to the cause of freedom. The lessons learned in those years would shape the future of industry, technology, and warfare for generations to come. The impact of American air power was felt everywhere. In Europe, the relentless bombing campaign crippled German industry, shattered transportation networks, and forced the enemy to divert precious resources to defend the skies. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Nazi Germany, was reduced to a handful of desperate pilots and obsolete planes. In the Pacific, American planes brought the war to Japan's doorstep. The B-29 Super Fortress, a marvel of engineering, flew missions farther and higher than any bomber before it. The Japanese military, already stretched thin by years of war, could not withstand the onslaught. The end was inevitable. But the story of America's 100,000 planes is not just a story of machines and numbers. It is a story of people, of the men and women who built the planes, who flew them, who maintained them, and who supported the war effort in 1,000 different ways. It is the story of Rosie the Riveter, of the Tuskegee Airmen, of the engineers and test pilots who pushed the limits of what was possible. It is also a story of sacrifice. For every plane that soared into the sky, there were lives risked and lives lost. Pilots faced flak, fighters, and the dangers of weather and fatigue. Ground crews worked in all conditions, often under the threat of attack. Families waited and worried, hoping for good news and dreading the worst. The war changed America, and America changed the war. The experience of building 100,000 planes forged new bonds between people of different backgrounds, broke down old barriers, and set the stage for the social changes that would follow. The factories that had built bombers and fighters would soon build cars, appliances, and the tools of peacetime prosperity. The lesson was clear: never underestimate the power of a united people, the strength of industry, or the determination to achieve the impossible. The skies over Europe and the Pacific had been won not just by pilots and planes, but by the millions who believed in a common cause. As peace returned, the world looked to the future. The technology and experience gained in the war would lead to new advances in aviation, in science, and in society. The story of America's 100,000 planes became a symbol of hope, of what can be achieved when a nation dares to dream and then works together to make that dream a reality. The laughter that once echoed in Berlin was gone, replaced by the roar of engines and the quiet pride of a job well done. The impossible had become possible. The world would never be the same. The war was over, but the legacy of America's 100,000 planes was just beginning. In the years that followed, the world would marvel at the scale and speed of the American war effort. Historians would study the blueprints, the production records, and the stories of the men and women who made it all possible. The lessons learned in those factories and airfields would shape the future of aviation, industry, and even civil rights. The veterans returned home, many of them forever changed by what they had seen and done. Some became engineers, pilots, or mechanics in the booming post-war economy. Others went back to farms, offices, or schools, carrying with them the pride of having been part of something greater than themselves. The women who had built planes and engines found new confidence and new roles in society. The barriers that had once kept people apart of race, gender, and class had been challenged by the shared experience of war. The planes themselves became legends: the P-51 Mustang, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-29 Super Fortress, and the C-47 Skytrain, each one a symbol of American ingenuity and power. Many were scrapped after the war, their metal recycled for peacetime needs. Others found new life in civilian roles, carrying passengers and cargo across continents. A few became museum pieces, reminders of a time when the world was on fire and the skies were filled with hope and danger. In Germany, the ruins of the Luftwaffe stood as a silent testament to the folly of arrogance. Göring, once so confident, faced judgment at Nuremberg. The world had changed, and the old certainties were gone. The lesson was clear: never underestimate the resolve of a free people, or the power of a nation united in purpose. The story of America's 100,000 planes is more than a tale of production numbers or military strategy. It is a story of vision, of courage, and of the belief that anything is possible when people work together. It is a story of laughter turned to silence, of doubt turned to determination, and of dreams made real on the wings of steel and hope. As the decades passed, the memory of those years faded for some, but for others, it remained vivid, a source of inspiration and pride. The factories that once built bombers now build the tools of peace. The airfields that once launched squadrons to war now welcome travelers from around the world. The spirit of unity, innovation, and perseverance lives on. And so, the next time you see a vintage warbird soaring overhead, or walk through a museum filled with the machines of that era, remember the story behind the numbers. Remember the laughter in Berlin, the determination in Detroit, and the miracle that was America's 100,000 planes. Remember that history is shaped not just by the powerful, but by the millions of ordinary people who dare to do the impossible. The skies are quiet now, but the legacy endures, a reminder that when a nation believes in itself, there is no limit to what it can achieve.